In a moment, David Paulides back with us. His latest work, Missing 411 Washington. Why are so many people just disappearing off the face of the planet? And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. David Paulides has had 20 years in law enforcement, 10 years specifically researching missing people in national parks, forests, and open spaces. He's now the director of the CAM Missing Project. In 2004, he formed the North America Bigfoot Search, where his investigative and analytical experiences were invaluable in researching Bigfoot Sasquatch sightings, encounters, and behavior, and has written a number of books and produced documentaries about his work. David, welcome back.
Hey, George, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Looking forward to this discussion with you. You just wrote a new book about Washington. That's Bigfoot country, isn't it?
Yes, it sure is. There's no doubt about that.
Is there a tie-in?
Well, I don't think so. Not with what I found, but there's a lot of people who believe so I'll let them have that. But I just, in my books about missing people, all starting with Missing 411, I try to lay out the facts, and I allow people to follow those and come to their own conclusions. Now, I've done 3 documentaries in the last 5 years, and each of them have gone to number 1 in the world: Missing 411, Missing 411 The Hunted, and Missing 411 The UFO Connection. Now, in there, I talked about some things that just couldn't be ignored that pointed to UFO involvement. Now, I got to say, George, you and Coast to Coast really put me on the map. Greatly appreciate what you've done. And a lot of what I do about my investigative background on these missing people has led to the establishment of the Can-Am Missing Project YouTube page, 570,000 followers. I post every other day a missing person case, and I go through it and I talk about it. And after looking at probably 10,000 search and rescue reports in the last 14 years, I started to develop some things that I call profile points. And those are things that come up time and time again on these cases. Now, they don't apply to every missing person case, but these are sort of like profiling missing people rather than profiling a crime. And to that end, one of the first points that I recognized after the first 100 cases I looked at was you'd bring canines to the scene of the disappearance, and the canines couldn't pick up a scent. Or they'd walk down the trail 5 feet, come back, and sit down at its handler's hands, and they didn't want to track. Another one is there's a weather event at the time the person disappears or at the time search and rescue shows up. Many of the times, if the people are found, they're found missing clothes and shoes. Most common time for a disappearance, after looking at thousands of cases, it's 4 p.m. Many of the missing have a disability or an illness that isn't obvious, but comes up when you look into the investigation. If the victim is found, the majority can't remember how they went missing or how they got out of sight or even how they were found. And many of the victims are found in or adjacent to bodies of water, swamps, bogs, ponds, creeks, and rivers.
And they're physically okay?
Sometimes they're deceased. Sometimes they're sitting there and they don't know how they got there. It really depends.
How many of the missing, David, disappear on their own as opposed to being with one or two other people?
Well, that brings up my next point. It's called point of separation. And here's the example. Say you and a friend go out and you're going to go hunting for some deer. And you get to a point and you say, hey, you go this way, I'll go that way. When that point of separation happens, it seems like there's something that happens. And one of those people will either become sick or one of them will disappear and maybe will be found, maybe won't be found. But it's very, very rare that two people go missing at the same time. It has happened, but those are some of the most obscure.
It's an unbelievable situation. How did you come across this in the first place?
So I was working on some things in a national park, and two national park rangers come up to me, and they start talking to me, and they walked away. I thought that was the end of it. And then later on, I'm staying at a location in the park, and one of the rangers that walked up to me knocks on my door and says, "Hey, Dave, can I talk to you?" I said, "Sure." So he comes in, he's off duty, and he says he and his friend had worked at several parks in their life. And during that time, they had worked several missing persons cases. And they started to feel like there was something more here than just your standard missing person case. And when they tried to get the reports themselves, they were blocked. And they said from there they knew something was wrong. They said, "Well, you have the investigative background, you're an ex-detective. Somebody really needs to look into this, Dave." Well, I left the park, called a couple of buddies in law enforcement. I said, "Hey, check this park and see if there's many people missing from it." They came back and they said, "Oh, yeah, there's a lot." And that's kind of how it all got started. And I started to apply some Freedom of Information Act requests against the National Park Service, and they threw every block in front of me for me not to get the information or to obfuscate me in some way or another.
Did you find that strange?
Not only strange, George, it's illegal. I mean, according to the Freedom of Information Act, they have to give up these documents. As an example, I applied for a list of missing people in the national parks, period. I got a note back saying they don't keep lists of missing people in their national park system. I said, "But on your website, you have a list of every movie that was made in your national park. And I know that I could get an Excel spreadsheet of every toilet paper roll that's at Yosemite. Are you telling me you don't keep a list of missing people?" "No, we don't keep any lists." Well, that got me kind of mad. So about 7 years later, fast forward, I had already written a series of books. And I had found over 90 people that went missing in Yosemite National Park. And within 6 months of me releasing that book that highlighted that number, all the missing people in Yosemite were put out on an Excel spreadsheet by Yosemite National Park.
Wow. Now, in your book that just came out, Missing 411 Washington, you deal with the story of Kenneth Arnold, who spotted UFOs for the first time over Mount Rainier in 1947. Tell me about that.
Well, I'm a MUFON investigator, have been for over a dozen years, and everyone knows about Ken Arnold. He was the person who really started the modern UFO age. And Arnold was a businessman from Idaho, and he was flying from east to west and headed towards Washington on a business meeting. And he had some time, and what he decided to do was to deviate just slightly and fly towards Mount Rainier. Now, why was he flying towards Mount Rainier? Well, on December 10th, 1946, 6 U.S. Marine Curtis commandos left El Toro Marine Base en route to Sandpoint Naval Air Station for some training, and each plane had about 32 Marines on it. And as they approached Washington, weather started to get a little bad, and 4 of the planes diverted to Portland, and 2 went on trying to make it to Sandpoint. 1 plane made it, and 1 plane disappeared that day. Well, as of the date June 27th, 1947, when Arnold was flying, the Curtis Commando hadn't been found yet. It was 6 months. They had done searches on Rainier, searches in the surrounding area. It was a huge endeavor by the military to try to find this plane, and they couldn't. Well, as Arnold is flying towards Rainier, he says, "Hey, I'm going to fly around the mountain and just see if I can see this commando because it disappeared somewhere around here." Well, he's about 35 miles from Mount Rainier, and he infamously saw 9 different UFOs fly past him at about 10,000 feet. And he had a watch on with his second hand, and he timed them point to point. And he came out in the paper and he said, "Well, if my math is right, these things were flying 1,200 miles per hour." And he described them the size of a DC-4 and moving in an odd motion like the tail of a kite. Some articles at the time described them as flying pipe pans. Well, he reported this. And a short time after that, a United Airlines pilot, a guy named E.J. Smith, came forward and stated that he also saw these flying discs flying Boise to Seattle as well. Well, needless to say, that definitely shook up the world. But really, why I put that in the book is a short time after that, the Curtis Commando was found. And it was found on Rainier. It had been there the whole time. And Bruce Maccabee later came forward and said, Bruce Maccabee, a famous physicist.
Right, he's been on the show before.
Yeah. He said that Arnold's calculations were 100% correct. They were flying that speed. Well, Army intelligence at the time met with Arnold and said, hey, that can't be right. You're wrong, blah, 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 on and on. Well, getting back to the Curtis Commando. A month after that, July 1947, the plane is eventually found on the side of Rainier by National Park climbers. It's the part that gets weird. They claimed that it was an extremely dangerous location, and they recommended that the plane and the bodies not be removed. And to this day, not one body has ever been removed off that mountain. No major plane parts have ever been removed. And I ask this, whatever happened to the saying, no man left behind?
Jeez. Over 70 years ago.
Yes. And it's about a year ago, I contacted a guide service on Rainier. And I said, hey, this is the area I want to go to. Can you guys guide me in there? And they said, no, we won't go there. And I said, why is that? He says, the Park Service says it's restricted and we can't guide you in there. You could go alone, but we can't take you there. I said, have you ever been there? Nope. I go, do you know why it's restricted? And he goes, I'm not quite sure.
It's bizarre.
Yeah, it's bizarre that the coincidence of Arnold seeing these 9 flying discs in conjunction with him being next to Rainier specifically to look for this Curtis Commando that had not been found.
And are you saying the bodies of these military folks are still on Mount Rainier?
That's correct. And in fact, the Navy put up a plaque on Rainier to kind of a dedication point to him, and it listed all the names of the men that are entombed on the mountain.
The families never got closure.
They never did. And it's a story that's really never talked about.
I haven't heard that much about it, David. It's unbelievable. It's uncanny.
Yes, it is.
I mean, are they like shredded in bones in their uniforms or whatever they were wearing at the time?
Well, these Curtis Commandos were big planes, big twin-engine planes, 32 people on board. You would think, I don't care how hard you slam into that mountain, there's going to be big parts of that plane there, and there's going to be body parts, you would think, all over the side of that mountain. And the thought that between the National Park Service and the Department of Interior, they restricted that and wouldn't let anything go out or in, I think it's a strange move.
Is it too dangerous to get a crew up there to do a search and obviously not rescue anymore, but just do a search?
I don't know, because I've never been able to get in there. And I have some respect. I have a lot of respect for military people, but I don't understand why the National Park Service is not allowing this to happen.
And is getting away with it.
Yes.
David, we're going to take a short break and come back and talk more about your work. The new work, his book is called Missing 411, Washington, and he's got a video out called Missing 411, the UFO Connection. We're going to take calls with David Paulides next hour here on Coast to Coast already, and his website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. He's got a YouTube presence as well. It is an amazing story that he has been doing all these years, searching for people who have disappeared on state parkland. Poof, they're just gone. And welcome back, George Norrie with David Paulides. David, not counting these missing military men and women, perhaps, how many people have disappeared in the state of Washington?
Well, you got to be careful here, because it's not just people who have disappeared. It's people that just fit this profile that we're looking at, and we're approaching 100. With the book that I put out, I like to put out a driving map as well, and there's a full driving map with the book with all the disappearances that I've researched in Washington plotted on the map. And the largest cluster of missing people in Washington is Mount Rainier. I know I don't like to write about missing climbers, technical climbers, because that could always kind of be explained away.
Right.
And I won't go into a whole lot of detail about the 15, but there is one case that I wanted to talk about that happened on Rainier, and it was the disappearance of two guys named Chris Hartonis and Raymond Vakili. Chris was 40 years old. Vakili was 48. They went missing November 5th, 1999, and they were at a place called Camp Muir on Mount Rainier on the Muir snowfield. It's on the south side of Rainier. And the route to that area of the hut, and they were going to stay at, starts at a place called Paradise at the bottom of the mountain. And Paradise used to be a golf course in the 1930s, and then in the 70s it was a ski resort. And they took that all away, and now it's just an area to start a climb. But NPS stated in their research that Hartonis was the most experienced person traveling to the Muir hut over 100 times in seasons of all types of weather. He was an FAA engineer living in Seattle, and Vakili was a friend of Hartonis's, and he had an equal amount of experience. And then there was one other guy that started the trip with these two, and they had summited dozens and dozens of times. Well, this group of three left on November 5th. The third person in the party was kind of dragging behind an old sled of his in the snow, got tired real quick, and he decided, hey, I'm just going to go back to the car. I'll meet you guys later when you're done. And again, that's that point of separation I told you about earlier.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the pair, Hartonis and Vakili, were seen ascending a location called Panorama Point by one of their friends. That's the last time they were ever seen. Now, a lot of people would just sign this off and say, oh, Dave, no big deal. It's just a couple of guys. But the statements that NPS made, National Park Service, is what really keyed me on this case. Now, the pair didn't return, and the National Park Service got involved. And there was a November 10th article that had this statement from the spokesman for the National Park Service, Mark Morgan. Quote, Hartonis is probably one of the most experienced people in the world on the Muir snowfield. And then after that quote, he said, bad weather hampered the search. Well, the Army sent helicopters and canines were used in this 10-day search looking for these two. Now, after that initial 10-day search, and you got to remember they're dragging sleds that have their stuff on it, nothing was found. And Mark Gauthier from the National Park Service made this statement. And this is pretty sobering. This is the fourth serious incident on the Muir snowfield in 1999. It's difficult to speculate what exactly happened to the men. It's perplexing when two experienced, cautious, and mature climbers just disappear. They were well equipped, and Hartonis was very familiar with the area. Both men have a history of good decision-making in the mountains, and neither had a reputation of pushing it. Efforts to locate them will resume this summer when the winter snowfalls begin to melt. It is hoped that clues will be revealed. Well, there was a second search that summer. Nothing was found. And to this day, nothing has ever been found of Chris Hartonis and Raymond Vakili.
How bizarre. And they were prepared for the elements, too, weren't they?
Like the National Park Service said, George, they were some of the most experienced men in the world on that part of the mountain. And when the Park Service comes out and says things just like that, I've never heard him say anything like that before. So I pay attention. And it's so unusual to have two people disappear. And these sleds they're dragging are probably 5 feet long. They're not going to go away. These things are huge. I can't believe it.
And as long as you have snow, it's not too difficult to pull, right?
Exactly.
Do they have weapons, David? Do you know?
No, climbers don't usually carry weapons. They're heavy, and they're bulky, and there's really no reason at those altitudes in their mind to be carrying anything like that. So I've never known a climber to carry one.
What do their family members say?
That's a very good question, and they never came forward and said anything to the press, and I've never heard anything more about this since it happened.
What does your gut tell you?
When you think about, well, first of all, there's other things that have happened high up on that mountain that are very strange that are in the book. But when the Park Service says these people just disappeared, those were his words. Those weren't mine. Where did they disappear to? And they bring canines, and the canines can't track where they went to. And we're talking about 25 years from the time this happened. There's been significant loss of snow and ice on the mountain. Where did they go?
I mean, if their bodies are there, the canines would have found it, right?
Exactly. And they rolled cadaver dogs through there, so a cadaver dog could pick up a scent 5 miles away.
It's unbelievable. I know you're hesitant to take a position on any of this, but you've got to have ruled some things in and out in your own personal mind.
And that's a good angle. I'm glad you brought that up. So one of the things that we go through in picking a case to do research on is we have to eliminate, number one, animal predation. On the side of Rainier up that high, no, there's not. There's nothing that's going to eat these guys up. Now, if you're in the North Cascades National Park, yeah, maybe there's going to be a grizzly bear or a mountain lion that could take you out. So when search and rescue goes in there, we read the reports and we see if there's any evidence of animal predation. If there is, we won't read the report. We're done reading it.
You're done.
Now, the other thing is some people want to disappear, and it's not against the law to disappear. If you don't want to be found, so be it. So if that's a choice and the Park Service or the search and rescue teams believe it is, that's another one that we'll just pass on. But in the grand scheme of things, the National Park Service search and rescue people and the private search and rescue teams that work away from the park, they're well attuned to what they're looking for, and they'll write it down on their reports. So when we start looking at a case, first thing I'm looking for is how did the canines react when they were put on the scent?
It's dramatic, David. I mean, and it's all over the country, isn't it? It's not just Washington.
Well, we put out a map of the United States and southern Canada, and there's 64 clusters of missing people throughout the United States. Now, there's a swath down the middle of the U.S., north to south, where on that map there's hardly anybody missing. And in Missing 411, the UFO connection, in the documentary we did, I got a call one time from a guy who worked for the government. He said, Dave, please look at this. Look at the Ogallala Aquifer. And you're going to see that the aquifer almost lays perfectly over your area. And I did, and son of a gun, it does. And one of the things that we work on when we're working these missing persons cases is we keep an eye on water, because in almost every one of these cases, water plays into it somehow. And in the UFO connection, there's a story in there in the movie about a guy in Wyoming. He was a farmer, and he was dying out there because he didn't have any water. And he had a couple people come out and try to drill for him, and he couldn't find any. And he said that some UFOs flew over his land and landed there. 2 aliens walked over to him and pointed to a place in the ground and told him to drill there.
Jeez.
This is a true story. A lot of people won't believe this, but when I came out with this story, a guy from Los Angeles, who was part of a film crew for the local news, went there, and he has footage when they were there interviewing this guy of UFOs in the sky above the property when they were there. Make a long story short, George, the guy who owns the land tries to get some people to come out and drill. And they said, hey, there's no water there. We've already drilled once. We're not going to steal your money and drill again. He buys an old army tank, and he does this makeshift drill, and he drills on the spot, and he hits a huge gusher of water.
Jeez.
Nobody can believe it. Now, here's the thing. that even the person who told me about the Ogallala Aquifer did not know. That guy hit an arm of the aquifer going into Wyoming.
What do you mean by that?
So aquifers have these arms that come off of them underground. One of these arms from the aquifer extended into Wyoming.
You mean like extensions?
Yeah. And this guy hit an arm of the Ogallala Aquifer. And how strange is that? Why would aliens want him to drill there and even have access to the water?
For themselves, maybe?
I don't know. But that swath of land down the middle of the U.S. is where the aquifer is at. And we don't have any missing people from there. Hardly any. I mean, there's a couple, but nothing really.
Of the missing people, David, how many have UFO reports surrounding these stories?
Almost none.
Okay.
Almost none. But we've done research on databanks to see if there's a history in that area. And in the movie The UFO Connection, we did a big segment on the area around Cheyenne, Wyoming, and where this guy hit this gusher. And there's a series of hunters we highlighted in the movie that are missing from this area northwest of Cheyenne. And all of the hunters in that area were all German.
That's peculiar.
I'd say so.
Do you put all this into a computer base?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. We've worked it 3 ways to Sunday. And
are you getting any common denominators?
Profile points?
Yeah.
German. Another one, part of that list, I didn't get to the final ones, but there's a series of intellectuals, George, that have disappeared. And what I mean by that, physicians, physicists. In my books, I've written about 6 physicists who have disappeared, who have never been found, and they're all German. I could not find anyone, a physicist, who wasn't German that disappeared.
What is the significance of that? It's bizarre.
I've had a lot of, I'm not proposing this is true, but I've had a lot of people write to me and say, well, Dave, you know, there's a whole Antarctica connection with the Germans, and they're supposedly still up there, and maybe they're taking people to work this project. I don't know. It's odd that they're all German.
That is weird.
And then there's a whole series of physicians who have disappeared. That's also odd.
Like they may be needed someplace.
And you know what? Oddly, George, your comment is interesting because all of these physicians were described as the nicest, most easygoing, the type of people that could live with anyone. And they were never described as hard-nosed, difficult to get along with. No, it was just the opposite, the nicest people.
Would you want to be plucked up and then just taken somewhere?
So,
and never returned?
You know, when you do these conferences in front of hundreds of people, you do them all the time, and you come up with some weird questions and things. And they said, well, we've heard this story about a guy who was taken, and he was given the option of going to live on a spaceship forever, or coming back to Earth, and this guy chose to go on, and otherwise they wipe your mind clean and they put you back on Earth. Well, on my YouTube channel, about a month ago, I did a series on people who disappeared and were later found with amnesia. And the interesting part about this was predominantly in the late 30s to early 50s. And then it almost seemed to stop. And there were a series of people, and I did videos on 10 of them, and they would disappear in one part of the country and disappear and be found hundreds and hundreds of miles away in another part of the country with no means of transportation from point to point.
And no recollection of how they got there.
Giddy up.
This is still, David, one of the weirdest stories I have ever come across. Strangest.
Well, it causes me to stay up nights.
How many people do you think disappear off this planet every year? I heard the number could be 100,000 people.
Well, I get a number thrown at me a lot that's saying, well, Dave, there's 600,000 people who disappeared last year in the U.S., and I got to kind of correct them about that. And that's the number that's reported in the National Data Bank. But that's not a number you can really put your hat on and say that's it. Because every time a child or a teenager runs away and a policeman takes a report, that's one missing person case. Now, a person comes back 3 days later, runs away again a month later, that's two missing persons cases.
Same person.
Same person.
Hold on, David. We're at the top of the hour. We'll come back and chat more and open up the phone lines. And welcome back to Coast. David Paulides with us. David, before we go to calls, can you share another strange story with us?
Love to. Sure. There's back in 1963, there was a boy named Bobby Pankinen. Super famous story that people probably never heard about. Far, far northeast Washington, about 10 miles from the Canadian border, middle of nowhere. There's a place called Deep Lake. I went there about a year ago researching this story. Very remote, absolutely gorgeous area. Well, in 1963, Bobby's dad, Mr. Pankinen, had just retired from the U.S. Air Force and had moved his family back to Washington State from Turkey, where he was working for the Air Force. They camped on the northeast section of Deep Lake near a small stream. Now, stop there for a second. People out there, I know in your fan base, watches the X-Files.
Right.
And I get asked all the time, Dave, do you have any disappearances related to someone working in the military? Well, when I started to research this case, I thought, man, this is getting pretty close. So hold that thought. The first day, the family was camping there, pretty uneventful. On the second day, Mr. Pankinen took his son, a boy named Ted, with him while he went fishing on the lake. And Mrs. Pankinen took her two younger boys, Bobby, who was 4, Jimmy, who was 6, and then one other boy, a son named Billy, 10, on a hike up the mountain to a waterfall that some people had told them about. And they had to go down this very old, rickety, rock-filled piece of garbage logging road to get to this waterfall. Well, Bobby wasn't wearing any shoes, and he was kind of tagging along slowly.
4 years old.
Yes. He was just wearing a swimsuit. Well, the family reaches the trail to the falls. And because Bobby was only wearing a swimsuit and no shoes, and they had to walk through some bushes and rough ground, Mrs. Pankinen told him to just sit down, don't move, wait there, we'll be back in a couple minutes.
Oh, jeez.
Well, point of separation. Family walks 10 to 15 feet into the falls through these bushes. Bobby sat on this road. In less than 2 minutes, the family's back. Bobby's gone. They said, I guarantee no car came down the road, because it's a horrible road, but car could make it down. But they never heard a car. They never had any dust.
You would have heard it bouncing along.
Right. There was no dust. There was no animals. There was no tracks. There was no nothing.
No scream from Bobby.
No scream. So no cars had traveled. They heard nothing. They saw nothing. They searched around the area. They get back to the camp real quick, and they call the Stevens County Sheriff. And they came in full force. First bloodhound arrived at midnight. And let me tell you, George, to get to this location in Stevens County from the sheriff's office is a good 2.5-hour ride. But they did come full force. And the newspaper in the county seat, I went there, talked to the people. They gave me everything they had. And they had pictures of the search site, of the deputy sheriffs working it. Well, the first bloodhound that arrived, took off on a dead run for 2 miles and came to what the paper said was a screeching stop. And there were no answers why the dog stopped. There was nothing to stop for, but it's like the scent trail just, boom, was gone. On August 6th, the Stevens County the sheriff's name is Dutch Holter, he held a press conference and admitted that he could not understand this disappearance. Until the day he left the sheriff's office 20 years later, he kept a photo of Bobby on his desk. The search lasted 7 days. They had equestrians, hundreds of people on feet, jeeps, canines. No bears or mountain lions were found in the area. On August 12th, Mr. Pankinen gave an interview, And this is what the quote said.
He must have been crushed.
Oh, no doubt, no doubt. He said, "It's as if Bobby climbed to the top of a tree and kept going." The sheriff stated that Bobby could not have walked far because he didn't have his shoes on. And
he's 4 years old.
4 years old. And there was nobody else in the area. No, the canines never picked on anything else. It's been 60 years since this happened, and there has never been anything found on Bobby Pankman. And of the remote locations I've been to and gone to hundreds of these, this is one of the most remote. Because when you look on a map, the Canadian border's 10 miles north, and for a good 12 miles going east, there's nothing. It's just deep forest, deep forest as you go that way.
That is bizarre. And then there's one on Jimmy Duffy. We'll talk about him in a second.
Sure.
To the phones we go. Mario in Brooklyn, New York. Welcome to the show. Hey, Mario.
Thank you for taking my call, George.
Yes, sir.
David, I asked this question to two other guests, and I got two different answers. Are you aware that a high-ranking military Israeli officer claimed that Israel and the United States has an intergalactic Federation agreement with the aliens where there's a remote possibility that the governments know about the abductions in exchange for alien technology? Is that a possibility?
So here's what I say to that. You know, I'm one of these investigators that really likes to stick to facts. And once I start to entertain something where there's no proof of it, then I start to lose my own credibility. Now, I don't want to put off any witnesses or people who believe that. And I would say, well, anything's possible. But until I see something that's more tangible, but I will say that the UFOs have been seen around these areas where many of these people have disappeared. That's a fact. So I'll hang my hat on that fact.
Now, with these sightings, have people disappeared right after that?
So here's one for you, George. In Missing 411, the UFO Connection, just west of Mount St. Helens, on Weyerhaeuser property, Weyerhaeuser had 12 tree planters on the side of a hill, very far up a hill. And they're hand planting these trees on an area that had been logged. And these 12 guys are all within shouting distance of each other, and they all stop in unison, and they see a UFO flying up a valley. The UFO stops over a herd of elk and focuses on one elk, lowers itself on top of the elk, and without any means of attachment, takes the elk and flies away with the elk. Now, these guys tell their boss, who works for Weyerhaeuser. The Weyerhaeuser boss calls Washington MUFON, and they send 2 investigators out. Ended up sending 4 investigators out, including Peter Davenport. And I interviewed them in the film. And one thing that was unison from every one of these men is that they were all afraid that that craft was going to come back for one of them.
Why would a UFO take a little 4-year-old boy?
No idea.
Or would it?
Well, back in the days when I was doing a lot of DNA work, several DNA experts said that up until the time you're 6 years old, your DNA is pure. I've always held that in the back of my mind.
What can you rule out in the case of the Bobby Pankman case? Can you rule anything out?
I think I'd rule out animal predation, human to human.
Abduction.
Yeah, human abduction. I think all that could be ruled out.
Could he have wandered away without shoes?
No, and that's what the sheriff said. He might have wandered 100 yards. That's what they said. And that's the part that the sheriff could never get over.
But if he wandered 100 yards, they would have found him in 2 minutes.
100% true. His mom would have found him.
The mistake she made was leaving him alone.
Point of separation. I tell everyone that. If you're going to go out into the woods, you're going to hike, you stay together.
Have you ever had a witness see another person disappear?
No.
That's never happened.
I've had a lot of people tell me about. Here's a quick one for you. A guy was hunting in Colorado up above 10,000 feet, right up above tree line. He's walking down a game trail, and he kind of had his head down. He said, I was done hunting. I was kind of making my way back to the car. I had my head down. All of a sudden, I picked my head up, and there on the trail right in front of me is this fog bank. And he said it was an odd-looking fog bank, because it looked super thick. He says, I slowed down, I made my way up to it, and I picked up my foot, and I could put my foot through the fog bank, and I put it through 1 inch, and I couldn't even see my foot on the other side. He said, it scared the heck out of me. I turned around, went the other way. He says, I've never seen anything since. He goes, I don't know what it was, but it wasn't normal.
West of the Rockies, Jason's with us in Olympia, Washington. Hey, Jace, go ahead.
Hey, thank you for taking my call.
Sure thing.
Thank you, David, for the work that you do. I'm a search and rescue volunteer coming up on my 10-year mark.
Thank
I've
you.
been doing this almost for 10 years and exclusively in the Olympic Peninsula, in the Olympic National Park. And the more work that we do up there, and as the years go by, the more stories I hear amongst our unit and other units that we work with. And I'm just curious if David has heard anything strange about the Olympic National Park, because I've got several stories and instances that I was personally involved with that really raised my suspicion on missing people that we have not found. And I advocate for anybody that has known anybody that's gone missing or is involved with finding the missing, just keep doing the work. Because
what has your gut been telling you, Jason, about these?
My gut instinct, I've seen several things up there as far as military helicopters at night that were never there before. I've lived in this area my entire life, 43 years, and I've seen military helicopters at night light stuff up with their lights and that were not involved with our searches. And I also have heard things out there that were unbelievably loud as far as screams. I'm just telling you, on a road, it's called Donkey Creek Road, leading up into the Olympic National Forest. We were on a search for a missing Boy Scout troop. We found them during the day, thank God. But on the drive back, I had to use the bathroom, got out of my vehicle, and I heard a scream that it was not a cougar, it was not a human, but the lung capacity had to be so massive that it scared me enough to where I couldn't get out of the area quick enough.
It's one of those
I
screams.
believe there's something up there.
David, have you heard much about that area?
Yeah, Jason, you still there?
Yeah, he's there.
Yes, sir. Yep.
So copy down this number, missing411@yahoo.com. Send me an email. Now I'll tell you about Olympic. First of all, I agree 100% with what you're saying. I've been there many, many times. We have two clusters of missing people in Olympic. One of them is way up by Nia Bay, and then another one is right in the middle of the park. And there's a whole bunch of people that I've documented over the years that have disappeared there under the strangest of conditions. One case is a physicist. He was getting his PhD from Oregon State. He and a friend went up there, and they were on a side of a mountain in the middle of the park. And they decided to split up and, just like I said, point of separation, split up, go different directions. That was 26 years ago. They never found the guy, and they still haven't found him. And by the way, he was German. But, yeah, that Donkey Creek Road, I know exactly where you're talking about. I actually knew a sheriff's deputy that worked up there that had a Bigfoot sighting right near Keats. And he's a good friend of mine. We talk all the time. He goes, David, walk right in front of my car during the day. How could I miss it? And I go, what'd your sheriff say? He goes, well, I told him. And he said, well, there's like 4 other deputies that have seen it too. It's no big deal. So for what it's worth, it's a strange area.
David, what % of the people who eventually go missing are show up alive?
Probably. So again, when you say missing, I don't work all missing persons cases. They have to fit this profile.
Fit in your profile.
Yeah, I would say 60% are found alive.
All right. What % are found dead?
Probably 40.
What % just never show up?
I can, when I say dead, I'm also clustering into that people that have vanished.
Well, let's go back to the dead again. What % are dead and they find the body?
That's probably 20%.
Okay, and then another 20% are just missing totally and gone.
Yeah.
Of these 3 steps, they're found alive, 60%, dead, 20%, missing, and they never have to show up. Which of those 3 categories baffles you the most?
It's almost the ones that are found alive, because the vast majority of those don't have any memory about what happened.
Isn't that bizarre?
Well, that goes back to, and you know this, George, and this goes back to my UFO work as a MUFON investigator. Abductees have that same issue many times.
That's true. That's absolutely true. Do you think they're being abducted?
Again, going back to the movie I made, you can't ignore the associations that I brought up there. It's just pure fact. The number of UFO sightings over that area of Wyoming and the hunters that have disappeared in that same area and the contacts made by farmers in that area with UFOs and aliens, and one of the hunters that disappeared there, I interviewed him, and he was 91 years old, quick as a whip, and I interviewed him on film for the movie for an hour, and this man said that he was hunting out there, lined up on some elk, fired his rifle, and he said, David, it was like everything stopped in slow motion. I saw the bullet come out the end of the gun, and it fell on the ground in front of me. I walked up, picked it up, put it in my pocket, turned to my left, and there was best I could describe as an alien standing there. And then he was put on a craft, taken to someplace, asked to walk behind a screen, and then they said, we don't need you anymore. And I asked him, I said, what do you think they meant by that? He said, Dave, I think they didn't want me because I had a vasectomy.
That's a good point.
And I thought, wow. Now, the biggest revelation to his story, which I've talked about in every one of my books, is that the number of people by themselves who fall to their deaths in the woods. Well, just casually, as this person's telling me his story, he says, yeah, the UFO dumped me on the side of a hill, and I remember falling about 10, 15, 20 feet.
Can't say that.
Oh,
We'll be back in a moment with more on Coast to Coast AM. David Paulides with us, Missing 411, Washington News. We shall be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. His website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. And welcome back, George Norrie with David Paulides. His website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. We're talking about his latest work, Missing 411 Washington. And let's go to the phones. Carl in the Bronx, welcome to the show. Hi, Carl.
Hi, George. Hi, David. Thank you for taking my call.
Thank you.
Yes, I've been listening to the program, and I know David Paulides for quite a long time. I believe that our DNA is being used for a hybridization program that the ETs are using to create humanoid beings that are amongst us, and also they are using our DNA to create the new world order. You know, it's a new world order, and also one of the major reasons why I called is that I wanted to know if David had done any work in Alaska, because it's one of the largest states of the United States where there have been missing people in Alaska. There is millions of miles of unexplored territory, most likely UFO bases in Alaska, and millions of one of the largest states where people have disappeared.
Have you trekked up that way, David?
Yes, I have. And I'm actually going to be going up there again on a cruise that's dedicated just to Bigfoot. And I did it last year, and it's unbelievable. The town hall meeting we had in in Juneau. And if you just Google Bigfoot Alaska cruise, you'll find it. But the other thing I want to tell people, George, is that please do not go to Amazon or any other online source other than ours to buy our books or movies, because you'll find my books for like $150, $200 on Amazon. That's not us.
Whoa.
I don't sell on Amazon. Those are resellers trying to rip you off. I just sell through our website.
Truly remarkable. This case, these series of cases, it can't be, like you say, an animal. People would hear the sounds of that creature ripping into a human being, or the human would scream. Nobody hears that, right? Well,
if you're an adult and you have Google, go Google animal mutilations or animal predation, and see some of the pictures, and they're very graphic, of people that have been attacked on the trail. The scenes are gruesome. There's blood everywhere. The ground's disturbed. I mean, when you fight for your life, there's a lot there to show what happened.
Let's go to Bill in Los Angeles. Welcome to the program. Bill, go ahead.
Hi, George and David.
Hi there.
David, I'm a former corporate newspaper writer interested in documentation of the paranormal, and you probably know there are published newspaper accounts of Sasquatches running off with young children or trying to. And recently there was a Coast guest named Bill Sheehan who described documented deadly attacks on humans by Bigfoot. And Bigfoot, as you know, is also linked to these weird screams and to cause missing time sensations in people, and also with UFOs. Is there any statistical correlation between human disappearances and coincidental Bigfoot sightings, especially in Washington State and Canada, both of which are Sasquatch hotspots?
Just so people know, I've written 3 books about Bigfoot. Spent a big part of my life researching Bigfoot. What that man said, I've never even heard. I've never heard of articles in newspapers saying that kids were taken by Bigfoot.
And Connie Willis had a guest on who talked about some of that, too. And Bill is spot on. Bill, in terms of the newspaper articles, where can we find those?
I can't remember exactly where that was, but I do remember seeing and or hearing about a newspaper account of someone who stopped what they identified as a Sasquatch from taking a child.
I've never heard that either, David. I've never heard that Sasquatch has been violent with a human. Have you?
There have been stories that go back 100, 150 years that talk about that. But as far as anything recently, no, I've no violence at all.
Before we go back to more calls, tell us about the Jimmy Duffy case.
The Duffy case is one of the top 10 cases I've ever written about. It happened in a place called Wenatchee Ridge in Washington. It happened October 19th, 1973 at 2:15 in the afternoon. His parents were Jim and Carol Duffy. They parked their camper truck on Little Wenatchee Ridge. It's a remote site about 150 miles south of the Canadian border. Jim Duffy was a hunter, and his wife, and his son and their daughter and their 2 cats in the camper up to this location, super remote. Well, Jimmy was misbehaving, got a couple swats from his wife, put in the camper, told to take a nap. The daughter was already in there. She was 18 months old. Jimmy was 4 years old.
Another 4-year-old.
Yes, sir. And they had 2 family cats in the back. And James was hunting the area, and Carol took the walk with him. I'm sorry, Jimmy was 32 months old, not 4 years old, 32 months old. And Jim and Carol were about 150 yards from the truck. And the camper had the closed door. It was closed. And they walk behind some trees, and they hear a super loud scream coming from their camper. So a couple seconds later, they run from behind the trees. They look at the camper, and the back door to the camper is open. They sprint the 150 yards. They get to the back of the camper. They look inside. Their daughter is still asleep. And here's the part that's bizarre. The cats are both asleep. And they look around. Jimmy's nowhere to be found. Now, everyone said that Jimmy was very light-framed, almost disabled in some ways. He wasn't going to walk far. Jim was a hunter. He checks the grounds around the area, doesn't see any tracks, sees nothing. They call the sheriff's office, and the sheriff's office calls Forest Service, and they all respond. Well, the deputies went back and forth between Carol and James while others were searching, interviewed them separately, trying to see if the stories matched. They did. They brought canines out. They found no scent trail. They called a full search and rescue call-out, 150 searchers, canines, rescue helicopter with FLIR. They brought out everything, found nothing. On October 24th at about 8:30, James was called aside by the lead deputy and told that nobody believed his story, and they thought that he killed his son and buried him somewhere, and he's not telling the truth.
Jeez.
Yes. Now, I got this because I got the full case file from the deputy, from the sheriff. Now, they come off the mountain a day later after 5 days of searching, and they get a call by the sheriff saying that they want him to respond to Seattle Police Department and take a polygraph test. So Carol and James go to Seattle Police.
Willingly.
Absolutely. Take a polygraph test simultaneously with different polygraph examiners. They come out, they're seated behind a table, and Seattle Police tells the deputies in front of Carol and James, this couple knows nothing about what happened to their son. They don't know where their son is. They didn't conspire to conceal anything. They're telling 100% the truth. In short, there were no tracks in that area. There was no culprit ever identified. There were no other hunters in the area. And the question I ask in the book is, what was that scream?
Was it a little boy or an animal or something?
But the better question, why would that scream be so loud coming from the truck 150 yards away that Carol and James hear it, but it doesn't wake up the daughter or the cats?
The cats would have been all over the place.
100%.
Weird.
One of the strangest cases, George, because...
And the little boy was 2 years, 8 months old.
Yeah. It was so remote. And you had that point of separation after they put him in the camper and walked away. And when they walked behind the grove of trees, something had to have been watching them to make the move on their child. And the thing is, James was armed with a rifle. So it was a pretty gutsy maneuver, but they never could identify what happened.
And little Jimmy never found.
Never found.
Let's go to Dan in Oklahoma City. Daniel, go ahead, sir.
Oh, thanks for taking my call, George.
Sure thing.
Interesting show. Very tragic, though, all these cases. One of the things I've been wanting to ask David last couple of times he was on was, in today's world with all the cell phones, where they can, if there's a missing person or if you just lose your phone somewhere, they can ping it to try to, use GPS to try to locate it. And so of the cases of the people that vanished, never was found or anything, I guess the first question would be is if they tried to ping their cell phone, did they at least find their cell phone? And then have there been, David, at least a handful of cases where people saw something really strange, they were about to be, say, abducted, but it was a near miss. They were able to get away. And have you been able to find and interview people like that that could give some clues to your research?
Good questions. First of all, I say that whatever's happening is 100% effective because that's never happened. No one's ever come forth and said, hey, I was almost taken, or this
There's
almost
never
happened.
been a botched
situation. And the other part of this is up until just 2 years ago, cell phones only worked off cell towers. And most of these cases happened in the woods where there was no cell reception. Now, in the last 2 years, phone technology has come so far that they now use satellite technology where you could use your phone as almost like a personal locator beacon where there is no cell reception and still push a button and get assistance. Now, since that's happened, that's kind of changed, and I'm waiting to see if there is anything like this man suggested that will transpire in regards to a missing person. Waiting to see.
I would guess most of the missing people of the past never had a cell phone on them.
Most of them did not. And in fact, when I go into the woods where there's no cell reception, I never take my phone. I'd be afraid to lose it. But now, with the cell phones, they do have this ability to work with a satellite on an SOS format, where they never did a few months ago.
Let's go to Brian in the state of Washington. Hey, Brian, go ahead, sir.
Oh, hi, George.
Hi there.
It's funny. Hi, David. Talking about satellite technology, I have the Galaxy S24 Ultra, and it has that satellite technology. But just thought, I live in Washington State, and I just wanted to ask David, because I was a hunter myself, and Natchez, Yakima Valley, we used to archery hunt up there. And I truly believe, I could be wrong, I think like, say, Bigfoots or everything else, I think they come out of portals. And I know, George, I had the chance to talk to you in Everett, Washington when I went to one of your shows at the Everett Historical Theater. And I believe that they come in and out of a portal, and it's probably why they never found a Bigfoot body or this or that, So, David, anyway, I know you're running out of time, so I just wanted your opinion on that.
We have suspected the possibility, David, that people are falling into portals and never finding their way back.
Yes. And in fact, I did a show for the History Channel called Vanished. And part of that is they had me interview a physicist about missing people. And he explained to me, he was a contract physicist for NASA at the time. And he said, Dave, there's no question if portals are real. In fact, a theoretical physicist is way past that. In fact, right now we're trying to understand how people arm them. And I go, what do you mean? And he says, I mean, direct the portal at something on the ground and make it disappear. And I said, do you think it can happen? He goes, oh, yeah. And he goes, there's a good chance that could be what's happening on a lot of your cases.
David, do you ever think we're going to get the real answers to this mystery?
Well, I think we're well on our way.
Will we be shocked?
I think it's outside the realm of the way most people think. And if that's the case, then people are going to have this resistance to believing this is even possible. So many people go to the woods and they think that that's their safe zone. And I tell everyone, hey, when you go to a national park, don't think you're safe there. You got to have your flashing yellow light on in the back of your head the whole time, because there's a lot of things in the woods that can kill you.
It is still by far the most perplexing story I have ever come across. And it's got to, how do you sleep at night?
Sometimes I don't, George. I mean, I have these cases rolling around my head, and I post a new case every other day.
So they're still happening?
Oh, yes.
Have they slowed down at all?
They might have, but I think that because so many people know about me and send me emails about cases I would have never heard about, the reality is they probably have slowed down, but because the breadth of people that know me and send me cases, it seems like it's increasing, but it's probably not.
David, until next time, my friend. David Paulides, just truly remarkable story. His latest book, Missing 411 Washington.